You're listening to the How to Talk to Girls podcast, where you'll learn step by step how to meet and seduce beautiful women. Whether you're looking for one night of fun, a week-long fling, or a long-term relationship. I'm your host, Trip, and the episode starts now. Hello and welcome to the How to Talk to Girls podcast. I'm your host, Trip Kramer from tripadvice.com. Today, I have a special interview with Mr. Jason Feifer. He is the editor-in-chief over at Entrepreneur Magazine. Pretty cool. And he's back because we did a previous episode where he came on. We talked about how to ask questions, how to ask good questions when you're talking to girls. But now we're talking about your story, right? So how do you tell your story? And that's going to happen. You're going to be talking to people. People are going to want to know about you. You're going to have to offer information, whether it be on a first date or the first time you meet a girl or whenever. And it doesn't have to be with just meeting girls. It can be with anybody. You're going to have to learn how to tell your story. How do you do that in a way where it's actually interesting and engaging and people want to hear more from you and they're listening and they're like, wow, this person's interesting. And how do you do that if you don't even have an interesting story? How do you find the interesting story? We answer all those questions today on this interview with Jason, and he does a pretty good job, gives you some really cool techniques on how to do it so you can walk away learning how to tell your story and then implementing it in the real world. So we're going to get into that very soon. Couple of announcements. If you don't already know, my book Magnetic is out and available for purchase. Audiobook is available. The audiobook is finally available. That is right. Magnetic. Cultivate confidence, become rejection-proof, and naturally attract the women you desire. 168 pages, maybe a 3-hour or 2 to 3 hour-ish audiobook. Also available on Kindle, all available on Amazon. So if you want a step-by-step process with action steps on how to meet and attract women, this whole book gives it all for you. Every single chapter giving you what you need to learn in order to become magnetic to women. And that is a promise as long as you implement the action steps that I give you in it. So this is not just a book that you're just going to kind of read and gloss over. No, it's a workbook. You're going to use it and it's going to work for you if you work it. So check it out on Amazon. Link in the show notes. Or if you don't know how to do that, because some people always have trouble going to the show notes for whatever reason, just go to Amazon, type in Trip Kramer with 2 P's or Magnetic Trip, and you will see it right there. So check it out on Amazon, and don't be afraid to just go look and see which medium is going to be better for you. Probably audiobook because you like podcasts, if you're listening to this right now. Anywho, let's get into our interview. I think you're going to like this. We're talking about storytelling, specifically your story. Here it is, the interview with Jason Feifer and myself. Hey, Jason, how you doing, man?
Hey, good to reconnect.
So happy to reconnect. This is now your second time on the How to Talk to Girls podcast. I will put the link to our initial interview that we did a couple months ago, where we talked about the questions and how to ask questions when you're on a date, when you're talking to a girl. And because Jason here is a journalist, he is the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine. He also worked for Men's Health, Maxim. He's a keynote speaker. He knows all this stuff. He knows how to talk to people. He knows how to ask questions. And more importantly, and this is why we're doing another episode, he really understands how to tell your story. Okay, because I'm guessing you've interviewed a lot of people and you've heard a lot of people's stories before and how they tell their story, right?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's the thing that everybody wants to do with me. They all want to meet me and then tell me their story because they want me to then tell their story. So yeah, all day, I'm hearing people tell me their stories.
Cool. And then isn't it up to you to hear their story and try to make it more interesting when you're writing about it, when you're putting it in some of these magazines?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what I'm doing is I'm filtering for the kinds of stories that my reader is ultimately interested in. So most people don't understand why I don't think that their story is a story for the magazine, for example, because which is not a judgment on what their value is or what their story is, right? The problem in this, I don't know that this is necessarily related to dating, but maybe I'll just say it, is that most people think that they have a unique story when they don't. And so They will tell me the thing that isn't actually unique instead of the thing that is unique. People have a hard time, I think, identifying what is unique about them. And so here's a good example. I get emails all day long from someone who's like, I'm a 19-year-old entrepreneur, or I'm a mom and an entrepreneur. And they think that that fact is unique and therefore deserving of attention. And in truth, I get things like that all day. And so it's not unique. And actually, I do think this is relevant to dating as I talk about it because people often don't think about what makes them unique and what sets them apart. And it's often not the first thing that you think of. It's often some path that you took or some insight that you have or something, right? That makes you unique. And I guarantee that everybody has something. If you think, well, my story, I have no story. You do. You have something, but you probably haven't thought hard enough about it, or you have overlooked it as the thing that actually is kind of that makes people's ears perk up. And you should start. Well, we should go. We can go into it, but I feel like you need to start figuring out what that is, and it's pretty easy to do it. You just start telling people lots of different things, and you notice what they're engaged in, and then you try it again.
I'm curious to know, you said, okay, you've heard from the mom entrepreneurs, the 19-year-old entrepreneurs, or whoever. So maybe you can give it a quick example of what is something that is unique.
Oh, sure.
From an example where you've heard the same thing over and over. Like, what was something that made someone stand out from someone who is doing something that's really the same as a lot of other people?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I got this email once from this woman named Joelle. And Joelle, bear with me here because the story will come back around to your question. Joelle makes a butter dish. And it is, so she reaches out to me and, of course, what she wants is attention for her butter dish. And what she surely does all day
What's a butter dish?
Oh, so, well, like it's a small piece of thing that you have in your kitchen.
It's a dish that holds butter.
It's a dish that holds butter. Yeah. So it's like a small butter-sized dish.
I don't know if you meant like it was a dish, like a recipe with butter in it or something.
Oh, no, sorry. No, literally a dish that holds butter.
Okay.
It's a butter dish. Yeah. So most of what she talks about all day, I'm sure, is this butter dish. And just that she has a butter dish and it's a great butter dish. And the reason that she has created this particular butter dish is to solve a problem. And that problem is that it turns out here's a fun fact, you don't need to refrigerate butter. And that, so if you leave butter out, it is nice and warm and easily spreadable instead of if it's in the fridge, like I keep my butter, then it's like really hard. You have to chip away at it. So you can do that. But the problem is that if you keep it on a normal butter dish, right? Usually what butter dish has like a little top to it that you pull off. The problem is that if you'll pull it off, you'll end up bumping the warm butter and then you got butter everywhere. So what she figured out was to put a butter dish on a hinge so that the top is on a hinge and it flips up and down. Therefore, where it's going is totally predictable and it never bumps into the butter. Clever, smart, right? But not all that valuable for me because, what I hear all day long, though that thing is unique to her and it's what ultimately, I guess, will sell somebody on her butter dish. When she's talking to me, that's not that unique because what it is like a sort of clever invention. Everybody's got a sort of clever invention. I hear about them all the time. So that's not going to work. But when she reached out to me, she told me this story. And the story is wonderful. Here it is. So she comes up with this idea for the butter dish and she wants to do some market research on it. She wants to know what people will pay for this thing, what kind of colors they like, basic stuff that you need in business. And she goes to a company and asks them how much they would charge her to do this market research. And they say $10,000. Now, she does not have $10,000 to spend on this. So she's not really sure what to do until she is sitting in the airport one day, flying wherever she was flying and looking around and realizes that the airport is full of people who have absolutely nothing better to do than answer questions about a butter dish. They're sitting around, literally nothing better to do. And so every time she needs to fly somewhere, she shows up like 5 hours early because you can show up whenever the hell you want if you're flying out. And she just starts making her way around the airport, approaching people and saying, hello, I work for a market research firm, which is a lie, but you never want to say that you're the inventor. And because then people will be nice to you and you don't want them to be nice to you. So she'll say, I'm a market research person And I would love your thoughts on this butter dish. And she did that. She just did that over and over and over again for many flights and many hours. And that is how she did her own market research without having to spend the $10,000. Now, I love that story because that story is all about resourcefulness and cleverness and not stopping when there's a barrier in front of you. And that is exactly the kind of story that I want to tell my readers. That's something unique. That was a clever, unique thing that she did that is so much more interesting than I have an invention that's sort of clever, right? And that to me is the lead in. Like that's a perfect example of the kind of thing that I think people should think about when they're telling their story, right? Like your story is not necessarily like your biography or your greatest hits or whatever. Like sometimes it's just something really fun and interesting that tells somebody something about you, because ultimately what people want to know is like, what's your deal? Who are you? Like, what are you about? And little fun anecdotes like that, little stories of something from your life, something that you did, that tells you more than any fact could, or any series of facts could. It's a tale, and it shows your motivations and your insights and your cleverness, and it tells about you instead of facts about you.
Yeah, and I also think even just zooming out on all this is, if you're on a date, you're talking to a girl for the first time, whatever, and you're able to tell a story versus saying facts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's already attractive enough and interesting to just be able to tell a story. Even if that story isn't like the most interesting thing, just the story itself. To be able to talk about yourself in story form.
Yes.
And do it in such a way that engages somebody. I mean, even that goes a long way. So just imagine if not only you could tell the story, but the story itself was interesting. To me now, that's a double whammy, right? And that's
Yes.
huge.
And what's really, really valuable about that, what you just said there, is that it creates entry points for responses. That is so important because you need, like, a fact is hard to respond to. I do this. Like, there's only one thing that you can ask after that, right? Which is like, oh, what's that like? Or how did you get into that, right? Which sometimes may not actually be all that interesting, depending on what your job is. But if you can tell a great story, it opens up all sorts of opportunities for her to respond. She can jump on, like, oh, I did something like that too, or oh, like that's such a funny thing. Whatever it is, like I think that conversation is really, it's like about doing two things at the same time, right? It's about offering something about you, but also making it very easy for the person to respond so that something builds upon itself. And stories are perfect for that because especially if you have a really good story, what you will do is prompt someone else to tell their really good story, and then you will learn more about them. And of course, once you get somebody else telling their story, they love you because everyone wants to tell their story, right? So if you are open and interested in what they have to say, they're rolling, and then they want to hear your next one. I mean, you become almost like story traders. But those things that reveal things about you are so much easier to respond to, which is so valuable.
So what do you think are some of the elements, or even before we go into elements of story, how do you find that about yourself? Where do you dig to find that? Because I can hear a lot of guys right now saying in their heads, oh man, I don't have that. I don't have that story. There's nothing interesting. Oh, I'm only 22. Nothing's happened to me yet. Or I don't know, I'm 40 and I just have lived a pretty average life. Like, where am I going to find this story about myself?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good question. So let me tell you how I handle my own version of this in my life now, which is public speaking, because I stand on stages a lot now and talk, and also am interviewed in lots of different capacities. And the way that I prepare for that is just by watching people react to me in the real world when I'm not performing. So I am always conscious of how people are responding to things that I'm telling them. And something just in the course of conversation, when you're really relaxed, right? Not when you're out on a date, but when you're just like talking to some people, or you're at work, you're shooting the shit, whatever you're doing, you'll end up telling them these things. And you can, when something you say is fun or gets a reaction, right? And every time that I do that, every time it's just in conversation, I just sort of get prompted or go into some anecdote about something and somebody reacts really positively to it. I note it. I note it. Sometimes I note it in my head. Sometimes, honestly, I note it in an Evernote. I have Evernote, which is this great app for just note taking. I have Evernote, and I have a folder in Evernote of just collecting notes of things that I've said in conversation that people liked. And
That's cool.
yeah, it's
That's a really
really,
good tip. I like
it's,
that.
thank you. It's really valuable. I was like, so for me, I call it, this is for speaking. I call my folder is called interlocking parts because that's how I think public speaking is. Like what you have is a menu in your head of like 5-minute interlocking parts, just like bits, just stories or insights or whatever. And they're interlocking parts because you can stand on a stage and just kind of string them together however you need to, which is not all that different from being on a date where you're just pulling from these things that you've talked about and you can rely upon them when you don't have an answer. Like I mean, you know what a great version, you know what a great example is? The butter dish story that I just told you a minute ago. I tell that story all the time. It's so useful in so many different ways. I know it's interesting. I know that people respond well to it. I've stood on so many stages now and told that story, and everybody always laughs. And it's a great story to have. So I always have it in the back of my head as one of my little parts. And that started with the very first time that I told that to somebody and they laughed, and I put it down in my little Evernote folder. And the
I,
more you do this, the more you build up this just arsenal of interesting things that you've like tested in the real world. You know that it works. And so you can employ them. And of course, you don't want to only employ them. You don't want to like go on a date and just say all the things that you've already said, but they're the things available to you. They're your fallbacks. And your goal might be to like say 50% of the 50% of the conversation is coming from stuff that you sort of have thought about, and the other 50 is just on the fly. And which is that I would say is roughly about every interview that I do. And now you feel prepared and confident because you know from your own life that people already like the thing that you're going to tell.
I like that. And I want to add in, I think people should do the opposite too. I feel like some people might get caught up in a story that they have that they like to tell that they think is interesting, but every time they tell it, it doesn't actually get a good reaction. But
Yes.
they're so I'm gonna blank because I know that I have one of these stories, but I don't remember what the story was. And even if it was, it won't be that interesting, right? Because I've learned that it's a story that I like to tell, that I enjoy telling, but I never get the reaction I'm looking for out of it. Yet I still tell it. And now I don't because I'm like, I think I've just learned that story is really interesting to me and in my head, but maybe it's the way I deliver it, the way I tell it, whatever it is, it's not as interesting as I always think it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So really what you're saying, Jason, and guys, listen to Jason here is take the notes on the things that you're saying that are getting those reactions. So then oh, cool. This is a story that works. This is an anecdote that works. This is something that people really react to. And I like that you're so proactive in just writing it down. Don't, trust your memory. Just write it down so you remember what it is and you can bring that up on a date or another time and know that you can really get some attention.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I really, that's such a good point that you made because everybody's got those things that they love to tell, and you become so enamored with it that you lose sight of the audience. And if the audience is bored, like it's time to move on. So I think that's really, really helpful. And of course, once you find something that's good, you can like refine it, which is really fun. If you just tell a story to some friends at work and they think it's funny, the next time there's some kind of opportunity to slip into it, like another conversation with some other people and you get into it. Now you like know what people laughed at last time, and you can think about how to amplify that, how to move through it faster, how to cut out the windy, boring parts. Like you can really refine a story without going through the process of like editing. Like it's not like you write it out and you edit it. You're just doing it on the fly. You're doing it in conversation with your friends, and you're just utilizing that time in two different ways. One, by just being fun with your friends, but two, by sort of almost practicing for the future.
I like that. That's cool. Okay, so now let's move into how do you tell the story? You found something. How do you tell it? Are there any good techniques or formulas you have for someone to be able to tell a story and make it more interesting, or even take, they're like they don't have an interesting story, but they know they have some stories. Maybe there's a way to craft it so it sounds more interesting.
Yeah. So here's the story 101. Story 101 is that stories aren't just a series of facts. It's not this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Great stories tell you what's going on, but also have moments of introspection. If you stop and listen to how somebody tells a great story, they're always also telling you what they're thinking through the story, and they're letting you in on them, which is often the best parts. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with David Sedaris, who is a great humor writer, but not like jokey writer. Like he writes these personal essays, and they're wonderful and funny. But what's so great about them is not just the weird things that happen, but how thoughtful he is about himself and the people around him. It's like he's almost doing like little character profiles, but it's complicated, not really where I mean to go. But what I want to say is like, when you tell a story about what's happening, be mindful of letting people into you as well. It's not just a fact that happened, it's an experience that happened. And then to that point, the best stories are stories where like there's some kind of some kind of evolution happens. Here's a great example is Trip, do you know what the hero's journey is?
Yes, I've definitely heard of this.
Yeah.
Really popular way of storytelling. A lot of movies are based on this formula.
Yep, that's right. That's right. One of the classic forms of storytelling, hero's journey, which is like basically 3 acts. Act 1, I set out to do something. Act 2, I failed or ran into an enormous challenge. Act 3, I overcame. That's the hero's journey. That's everything. That's literally every movie that you've ever seen is the hero's journey. And I find that the hero's journey is kind of applicable in some way to like everything, right? Like the Butterdish story was a hero's journey, right? She like set out to do something. There was a challenge. She overcame. And your career path can be a hero's journey. Like whatever, so why'd you move to Boston? There could be a hero's journey there, right? Like, if you think about it in that way, where what you're doing is you're able to present the downside as upside, whatever it is. Like, you present there was a challenge, I ran into some problem, there was this thing, I didn't know what to do. But the hero's journey means that you're going to triumph in the end. And that's great because I think that everybody should share, and this goes back to my first point here, where you're sharing insights into what you're thinking. I think everybody should share some vulnerability, but I can understand and appreciate that sharing vulnerability can be scary and challenging. And also, if just on its own, it's like a big block that you slapped on the table and she doesn't know what to do with, right? Like, I'm very uncomfortable doing this. And then she's got to like deal with that, right? Or like, I don't really like my job. And then now she feels like she has to manage that in some way. But if you pair it, if it's just part of the journey and then there's a resolution to it, there's some kind of action you took, something, then you get to share that vulnerability, which I think is so important because women and just people in general love hearing somebody open up and share not just the confidence, but the raw side too. But you are feeling confident in sharing it because it's part of the hero's journey, and the next phase of the story is the triumph or the resolution or something. It's a really good way of framing whatever you're uncomfortable with in a way that you can be comfortable with.
So do you think that a guy should kind of look back on his life and say, what is something that I overcame?
Yeah.
And kind of work from that angle?
Yeah. You know what the story was for me when I was dating? So there were 2 that would always come up. One was like, my career path and whatever. But the other was this fun fact about myself, which would it would always come up, and sometimes I would just slip it in because I knew that it would make women curious, and suddenly they'd be asking a lot of questions. I don't have a sense of smell, and therefore I don't have a sense of taste. Fun fact. And so, if you just drop that, like I don't know, it doesn't feel like a disability, but whatever. Like there's something wrong with me. Then if you just like drop that on the table, she's like, oh, right. But if you tell it in a story, So I don't have a sense of taste. It's the weirdest thing. It's totally fine now. Like I'm not sad about it. But tell you how like I discovered it, and then and then I tell the story of how I sort of figured it out, and then went through, and it was like confusing, and there was always like a funny moment or two, and then I come out like fine, right? Now she has a million questions, and also I have like revealed something while at the same time not making her feel bad that she has this information, right? Like I'm okay, it's okay, right? But it's something that happens, some challenge. It's an ongoing challenge, and yeah, I think that that's great. I think that it's great to share that, just something that you overcame, some challenge that you carry with yourself, something that you're striving or working towards. All of those can make for excellent stories, and all of those like just they're full of experience and insight into you.
Right. They get to learn about you. They get to be entertained by the story. They get to see confidence, really, because if we're talking about a story that you overcame something, even though you're being vulnerable about something, you're also saying how you kind of won in the end.
Yeah.
You know, you beat
Right.
whatever the challenge was, or you
Yes.
overcame whatever it was. And I think everyone has something like that in their lives. I mean, I have one of those stories of how I became a dating coach. I mean, it's not a very normal job. And so I have a whole story of how I got into it and how I was able to actually, get it going and make this weird hobby slash passion of mine into something that I can do for a living and then be able to do it all day, every day. And it was challenging to do that. So I think people can even look into their careers and how did they get to where they were? Sure, it wasn't easy. I'm sure there was some sort of challenge. So careers is a good place to look.
Hmm.
Maybe something with, I don't know, something with a friendship or something with family that happened, or maybe something that you worked on in school or some sort of achievement that you did throughout the course of your life. And here's another thing too, is now that, and I'm talking to the listener, okay, now that you know this, wouldn't it be cool to start doing more things in your life to start creating more stories? It's like now that you know that this is a way to engage someone. It's like, well, if you really got nothing, or you're just really struggling here, and you're going out on a limb, finding a really small part of your life that you can try to extract and make into a big story. If that's you, start creating more stories in your life. Do more challenging things. Get outside your comfort zone. And the more you do that, I mean, the more you'll end up having more stories. So, for example, I would say like going skydiving, that could be a great story. Sure, we all know what skydiving is and entails, and maybe you even know more if you've done it. But the way that you might tell it might be more interesting because maybe it's a challenge to you. So always I'd say whenever something scary comes up or there's a fear involved in doing something new, remember, like, you know what, I got to do this thing because this is going to be a really cool story. I also say to people too is whenever people have a really bad moment, that could also tell for a good story. So here's an example. Actually, I'll tell someone else's story that I just heard the other day. Basically, there's a story of this one girl who is learning how to teach a dance class. Okay. So it's basically you're teaching this dance class. It's like a cardio dance class, and she's training to be a full time instructor to teach multiple dance classes per week. And you're pumping people up. You're doing the dance. You're teaching people the moves. So it's a very intense kind of gig. And so on the first time that she ever did it, and she's going through training, at the end of the session, she looks over to the person training her and says, "Oh my God, I got to go puke." And she runs to the side of the room and just starts vomiting in the trash bin. Okay. And when I heard this story, the way it was told to me was like the girl who did this was mortified. Like it was terrible. It was terrible. Like she was so embarrassed. She was just like, I'm never going to be able to do this. This is not for me. And so as I'm hearing this, I'm like, you know what? This is going to be a great story for her in like a year. Right now, it's hell, right? She just went through a really terrible, maybe even semi-traumatic experience where she's like trying to be this dance instructor, and at the end of it, she vomits, right? Like terrible. But in a year from now, she's going to look back at this and she's going to be like, oh my God, this is going to be a great story to tell because now I am a dance instructor and I'm killing it and I'm doing well. And it's going to be fun for her and exciting for her to be able to tell that story, which started off pretty traumatic, but then overcoming that challenge and moving into something more positive. But even if she didn't, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Even if she decides never to be a dance instructor again, I still think that's an interesting story. Just say how like, oh yeah, this one time in my life I tried to, do this one thing and oh my God. And then she gets to tell the story in more detail and how she perceived it. And then at the end pukes. Cause that's like that doesn't happen often. And so,
Oh, yeah.
and so just hearing that, I was like, okay, now it sucks, but later on it's going to be awesome. So for you guys, whenever you're going through something that sucks and is traumatic and is really hard and scary, just know in like 2 months, 3 months, this will be a great story to tell people.
I live by that. I live by that. That's sometimes the motivating force for something. And as a writer, I'm in a fortunate position because I can often take my stories and like do something with them. But often the reason you're just like you said, the reason to put yourself into some uncomfortable situation in the first place is for the story. And I always think whenever I'm going through something that I don't really feel great about, I think, well, at least I'll have the story. Like at least at some point, this is going to be a useful experience. I don't know when, but at some point. And you need those downtimes. Often when I speak, I talk about the very first time that I did it when I was standing on the side of the stage. I was super nervous. I didn't know what I was doing. And I like went out and some jokes didn't work. But like I needed that. I needed to go through that in order to have that story to stand on a stage later and tell and people like it. So it's just what you said is so, just so true. I couldn't say so true more enough.
Oh, good. I'm glad you agree. No, I mean, yeah, I just think that's what's kind of cool about it is if you don't have anything now, work on the things that can become those stories. And I think that's going to help you live an actual more interesting life. But either way, I think we've kind of covered some good ground here on how to find that story. And then again, how to tell it, right? The formula is here's something you did and then you failed or you were going through a challenge and then you overcame it. I think that's pretty simple. And then I think, and maybe Jason, you can talk a little bit about this is, you were talking like not giving as many facts. So how do you tell a story if you're not just giving facts? Like what other parts are there?
Oh, yeah. Well, so by facts, I mean, think about the way that a children's story is told. Spot is a dog. Spot runs. See Spot run, right? Like you never get into Spot, do you? You never learn anything about Spot. It's just really surface level. And that's what I mean by that, right? There's a difference between here's a great, one of the examples you gave there was skydiving, right? So here's how to tell skydiving as a fact, right? Imagine you sit down with a woman and somehow this seems like a relevant thing to bring up. You're talking about fears that you have or whatever. And you say, I skydived, period. Right? That's a fact. Or you could do I skydive. It was in New Zealand. It was pretty. Like, you're not sharing anything. It's not a story. It's not like what you need is, oh yeah, I skydived. So I really wasn't going to do it at first, but then my friend Dave like talked me into it. And, we were like in the plane. I can't tell you like just how unbelievably afraid I was. Like I was going to vomit. And then, actually I did vomit and whatever. Right? You just need to bring people into what you're thinking, what you are thinking, and what you think about. Almost like, listen, when you're telling a story, everything in the story is like setting or character. So you are a character and people want to know you as the character. You're the character in the story. So tell your character, like bring her into you and your experience in your head as you're moving through a story. That's the difference. I oftentimes, I think that when people are bad storytellers, they're often just, like I have a high school friend who I will not name, who's a terrible storyteller. And this person, every time that I hear a story from this person, it is just a string of information. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And it's so boring because it's just facts. What I want to know is like, what was it like? What did you go through? What were you thinking? And that's like be introspective. Sometimes I just want to yell, be introspective. Like tell me something about you. And that's the difference between a great story and a fact, is that a fact doesn't let you in because there's nothing to let in. A fact is just a dry piece of information, but a story has to contain insight and character. You're a character. Tell me your character.
Yeah, and how you feel and the details. And details, I think, are really strong too in
Yes.
stories. Even if they are factual, just little details like that get someone sucked into the story. Let them know, give them what you saw, what you smelled, what you tasted, what you heard, like those details, all the senses. Maybe not
Yeah.
literally all of them, depending on what the story is, but diving into those details can really help someone picture what's going on. And then all of a sudden they're escaped into the story and they're present with you in that story and you got them hooked on there,
Yeah. Details, great. I mean, great writing and great storytelling is all in the small details. It's those little things like the color of something, the brand of something. I would challenge your listeners to just the next time that you're hearing somebody tell a great story, which could be, maybe you listen to like a comedy podcast or something where people tell stories, or The Moth or something like that, or just friends at work, whatever. And if you're really engaged in something, like the minute that you catch yourself being super engaged in a story, start thinking about the story. Like pull yourself out of it and say, okay, this is a great story right now. What are they doing to make it such a great story? Okay, one, yeah, the details are awesome. It's just so detailed. And two, I'm really with this person. Like I feel like I'm experiencing what they're talking about with them because they're just so willing to let me in. Like you'll just start to see it. I mean, this is how I became the writer that I am, is that every time I would read a magazine story and realize, oh, this is a great piece, I would stop reading it for enjoyment and I would start studying it. What is the writer doing? How do they make that transition? Why was that funny? Like what was leading up to that? And you just start to see the patterns and then you can start doing it yourself.
I love it. That's great. And speaking of stories, you've written a story recently. You wrote a book called Mr. Nice Guy. Maybe you can
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that, Jason.
Yeah, sure. So, talk about as we did about how challenging experiences feel a lot better once they become stories. So, Mr. Nice Guy is a novel that I wrote with my wife, and it is a romantic comedy. It's set in the magazine world, where obviously I work, and it is about two people who each week sleep together and then critically review each other's performance in a magazine, or each other's sexual performance, I should say. It's not like a bodice ripper. It's like a romantic comedy, but there is a lot of sex in it, and it's about these two characters who kind of square off in this very public, intimate way, and a lot of what's in that book, because the main character is this guy named Lucas who's 20. He's in his early 20s and he is dating really for the first time because he had a girlfriend out of high school and then they broke up, and so this is the first time he's kind of out in the dating world, and he's a fumbling mess. And that was me. I mean, that was me when I moved to New York. I moved to New York actually at the age of 28, and I had been dating this girl from college on. So 8 years I was with her, or 9 years or something. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I went out date after date and made many, many, many mistakes. And honestly, really, even then, I would walk away from just a sort of terrible date, and I would think, well, good story. Like it's good for something, right? I don't know what, but it's good for something. And what we ended up doing is my wife and I put it together into this book called Mr. Nice Guy. And it was so satisfying, I have to tell you, to have found a place for these experiences, to move them into like a place where they felt constructive and entertaining, and I sort of was able to make sense of them. And so that's the book. And in so doing, we in telling these stories, I feel like I also, and this is something I think that you may find as you challenge yourself to tell better stories, you almost start to make sense of your experience more. You realize things that you did or why you did them in ways that you may not have until you were trying to explain it to someone in a really cogent way. I find that to be really useful, and also it just makes for a better story. Like when you tell somebody you're doing something, and then you say, hey, and now I look back on it, I realize I didn't mean that at all. I was trying to do this other thing, and which is great. I love those realizations because they invite people to kind of join you on your quest of discovery. Yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but anyway, the book is called Mr. Nice Guy. It's a lot of fun.
Cool. Where can people find that?
Anywhere. I mean, the obviously easiest place would be Amazon or any online retailer. We also have it's in paper, ebook, and audio form. So if you use any audiobook platform, then it's there. Or you can walk into your local Barnes and Noble or something, and I hope you can find it. You should be able to find it.
Cool.
We'll see. If you can't, let me know.
Awesome. Guys, go check that out. Mr. Nice Guy. Jason, thanks for being here, man. Thanks for giving us some really cool techniques and our formula for finding a story and being able to tell it right. I think the guys can now take some of that information away and be able to use it and be able to just help themselves become more charismatic when they're talking to people, which I think is really one of the better benefits of being able to tell a story.
Oh, yeah.
Being charismatic. And that's obviously very attractive to women and to people in general.
Totally. And, the more confident you are in your storytelling, the more charismatic you will become. So, thank you, Trip. And everyone go tell great stories.
Awesome. I love it. Jason, thank you again. Thanks for being here. Guys, again, go check out Mr. Nice Guy. And Jason, maybe we'll have you back on for another episode. That was number 2.
I'd love to do it.
Number 3.
Let's go for 3.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much.